Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. I'm David Horn. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our pleasure to host this celebration of the publication of the ABCs of Democracy and this rare opportunity to see Hakeem and Hasan Jeffries share the same stage for the first time since they were at church together many years ago. I'm sure they've been to church since then, but they just haven't been on the same stage. I want to welcome Leader Jeffries, Professor Jeffries, and the other friends and members of the Jeffries family who are with us here today. We're pleased also to be joined by Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who represents the 3rd Congressional District. As well as by other local political leaders and leaders of the university. And I want to welcome especially the hundreds of students who are joining us thanks to the generosity of Gramercy Books. I'll remind you all to silence your phones, and it's now my pleasure to introduce the two people whose collaboration made today's event possible. Linda Cass is the founder and owner of Gramercy Books in Bexley, one of the great independent bookstores in the Midwest. Linda has an MA in journalism from our college, has served on the university's board of trustees and the foundation board, and is an author in her own right, most recently of 3 critically acclaimed novels. Gramercy Books has partnered with local schools, libraries, and our college to promote sustained student engagement with creative writing, with books, and with their authors. Professor Scott Levi is the chair of our Department of History. A specialist in the economic and social history of Central Asia, Scott joined our department in 2008. Is that correct? Scott's research has been supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, long may it last, and the Social Science Research Council, among other agencies. And his work in the classroom has been recognized with the university's Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, our highest award for teaching. Most recently, Scott helped bring into being our new Arts and Sciences major in leadership, one of the first of its kind in the country, and which started enrolling students just this semester. Please join me in welcoming Linda Cass and Scott Levi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, David. Big thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences and the Department of History for partnering with Gramercy Books to present this extraordinary event for Central Ohio. At Gramercy Books, we live community and face ongoing societal issues through education and dialogue. We are so grateful to be part of a business that allows us to provide diversity of voices, whether on our shelves or through the ongoing author events we offer. This afternoon, we are particularly thrilled to bring U.S. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries to Columbus to be in conversation with his esteemed brother, historian Hasan Jeffries. I want to preview our time together today. After introductions, Leader Jeffries and Professor Jeffries will talk for up to an hour. That will be followed by a shorter period for questions that many of you submitted to us in advance. Thank you for that. Professor Jeffries will moderate those questions during that portion of the program. Gramercy Books hosts a vast range of meaningful author events almost on a weekly basis, and today closes out our programming for this year. Upcoming programs for 2025 can be found on our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, and they include a Black History event in February showcasing a groundbreaking book picturing Black history, photographs and stories that changed the world, and authored by several historians from your department, the Department of History, Scott.
Thank you very much, Linda. We look forward to that program as well. And thank you also for your central role in making today's event possible. It's my distinct honor here to be representing the Department of History. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Dr. King made that statement in the Washington National Cathedral in spring of 1968. What's too often forgotten is Dr. King's cautionary note that it will only bend toward justice if people are willing to exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. Standing here, nearly 6 decades later, with some challenging years behind us and the roaring tumult of the new year on the horizon, it does feel as though that arc is impossibly long and rigid and in constant need of shaping. We are honored today to host a conversation by 2 individuals, 2 brothers no less, who have dedicated their professional lives to the work of bending that arc toward justice. My job today is a very pleasant one. It's to introduce my colleague and my friend, Dr. Hasan Jeffries. Before I do, I'm going to make one very brief but very important digression. Among the many distinguished guests in this very large audience today, we have Mrs. Lenita Jeffries, who has the distinct privilege, at least I hope it's a privilege, a pleasure, of serving as the mother of Hasan and Hakeem Jeffries. Not yet, guys. I still got to say a few nice things about you, Hasan. Your kids are finally in the audience. Every other time I say nice things about Hasan, the kids are already off. They're already taken off. Now back to the task at hand. Hasan Jeffries is OSU Arts and Humanities alumni, endowed professor of history. His exemplary classroom instruction in the field of African American history has earned him both the College of Arts and Sciences Award for Outstanding Teaching, as well as the OSU Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Again, the highest teaching honor that Ohio State has to offer. Professor Jeffries' public history work is extensive. It includes hosting the podcast Teaching Hard History and narrating the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement. Professor Jeffries has served as an educational programming developer for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. He has served the Ohio Department of Education. He has served as a member of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice program on teaching hard history, and he has served as the lead historian for the $27 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, where Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, and the list goes on. Dr. Jeffries is an accomplished scholar. His many publications include his book, Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, and he is the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, an incredibly powerful and incredibly popular collection of essays by leading civil rights scholars on how to teach the most important lessons of the civil rights movement. And that list goes on too. But I'll stop here and turn the podium back to you, Linda, to introduce our esteemed guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. American values over autocracy, benevolence over bigotry. So begins Hakeem Jeffries' illustrated book for all ages, The ABCs of Democracy, inspired by his rousing speech delivered in January of 2023 upon his historic elevation as House Democratic leader. Equal parts inspiring and urgent, his words provide a timeless reminder of the core values that have made America a great nation, while presenting the critical issues our country confronts. In clever and memorable turns of phrase, Leader Jeffries paints an alphabetic roadmap for a brighter American future. Hakeem Jeffries represents the diverse 8th Congressional District of New York and is serving his 6th term in the United States Congress, where he has been a tireless advocate for social and economic justice, working to create more affordable housing, reform our criminal justice system, lower prescription drug prices, and ensure that all Americans have access to a high-quality education. He was unanimously elected to the position of House Democratic Leader by his colleagues in November of 2022. In that capacity, he is the highest-ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. Leader Jeffries has demonstrated his extraordinary leadership time and again, drawing on his Brooklyn roots, the Baptist Church, hip-hop music, the values of his civil servant parents, and his compelling skills as a litigator and orator. Prior to his election to Congress, Leader Jeffries served for 6 years in the New York State Assembly. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from the State University of New York at Binghamton, his master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University, and he graduated magna cum laude from New York University School of Law, where he served on law review. Leader Jeffries lives in Brooklyn with his family, and I understand he's an avid Knicks fan as well. So now, let's bring to the stage Hakeem Jeffries and Hasan Jeffries, the brothers Jeffries.
I got a little excited and jumped the gun coming out. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is truly a delight and a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Dean Horn, to Scott, and to Linda for making this happen. I've been teaching at Ohio State for some 20 years, so this has been 20 years in the making, all right, to be able to come and to share some thoughts and ideas around these critical questions of politics and American values with my brother, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. So thank you all for being here. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of background and the book a little bit, and then we have some questions that I haven't looked at yet that were shared by some of the audience members and participants. So then we'll save some time to make sure that we get to those as well. So glad to have you here, man.
Good afternoon, everybody. So good to be here. So good to be in Columbus at the Ohio State University. And congratulations on a big win yesterday over in Indiana. OH? All right, I know where I'm at.
Very good. So the book that many of you all have received and purchased, and the reason why we're here, the ABCs of democracy. Folk always ask me, "Oh, you must talk to your brother all the time." Let me tell you how much I talk to my brother. When Scott reached out and was like, "Hey, Linda, they want to have bring your brother to campus to talk about the book," I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, this is great." And then I immediately text Hakeem, "You got a book?"
Few things going on in Washington, D.C. By the way, let me just acknowledge my good friend, my classmate, an amazing member of Congress who represents you all here so extraordinarily well, the Honorable Congresswoman Joyce Beatty.
So in this book, the ABCs of democracy, the very first illustration is that which you see, American values over autocracy. And as I think about American values, there are a couple of components to American values. And I haven't shared, but we're going to do a little walk through a little family history, if you don't mind. Our mom is here. Mommy, if that's okay, we're going to share. All right. So family is one of the sort of central, I think, values, right, for us. And I don't know if you can see, but this is a photograph of our father and mother with our grandmother, Grandma Lee, holding you because you are the firstborn, as you like to remind me quite often, family. But then you had to move over. And you weren't very happy about it. So
I led the way.
but you made room, so I appreciate that. And then that gets us to, this question of sort of family, right? When we think about, I just want to note too, who mommy is holding. I think that's probably important to note. But the question of family, we think about American values, we think about family. How is family one of these American values? And at a time in which we're defining and expanding what we mean by family.
Well, I think that when you talk about American values, and there's so many, but in going through the alphabet, I thought it was important to lay that out right at the gate and contrast that, of course, with a very different vision for how the world should be, which would be autocracy. American values, that's family, that's faith, that's freedom, as central to who we've been along the journey. I think what's been important is that we've been around for 248 years. We're going to approach our 250th birthday on July 4th of 2026. That's a monumental, consequential moment for all of us to reflect on who we are, who we've been, where we're heading, and certainly the continuing march toward a more perfect union. It's been American values, century after century after century. Presidents come, presidents go. American values, our institutions, our ideas, and our ideals remain the same. And, for me at least, growing up, of course, with mom and dad, both of them being public servants, in a working class neighborhood in central Brooklyn, union household, those hardworking values that we were taught. Of course, growing up in the Cornerstone Baptist Church was incredibly important. We used to go to church. I mean, if it was raining, snowing, sleeting, or hailing on a Sunday morning, it didn't matter. Mom was taking us to church. And, that was an incredibly important part of our journey growing up in Sunday school, all the way through the usher board. Of course, coming of age.
Wait, let me interrupt you there,
Yes.
Because you can't see over your shoulder, but we actually have a photograph of us at Cornerstone. High school age, you could tell by the haircuts at the time. But again, the question of faith, right? Faith as a family value. But go ahead.
That's right. And, even just growing up in a very diverse Brooklyn, coming of age, in the 80s, there were challenges, the crack cocaine epidemic certainly being, a significant one. But, we went to public high school, Midwood High School, which is an incredible high school, 4,000 student high school, very diverse, people of every race and religion, of course, and ethnic group, and that's Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s. By the way...
And speaking of the 80s and 90s, this is your high school graduation from Midwood High School.
That's right.
There we go, 80s and 90s. Midwood.
And I got a Midwood High School story. This was actually a big surprise. So we did a book event on Thursday in Manhattan, and before the event, I was told that there was someone special who was there to see me, Mr. Wilner, who was my high school social studies teacher. And he's in his 80s now, but Mr. Wilner, legendary teacher, I couldn't believe. From time to time, we sent notes to each other, but I couldn't believe that he came out. So I said, of course, bring Mr. Wilner in. So I see Mr. Wilner, and he says, Hakeem, I brought your freshman year social studies grade with me. I got real nervous, y'all, because there were other people in this room. But it's Mr. Wilner, so I said, oh, yeah, of course. I'd like to see it. And so he brought out his grade book, all handwritten, and, showed the different, 3 stages of the first semester, and then pointed. And you were a good student, Hakeem, so don't be nervous. I got a 90. I was so relieved. And then he said, Mr. Wilner said, and I had your brother a few years later. I said, show me his grade. Thankfully, Mr. Wilner had it. And he turns to it, and he says, this is Hasan Jeffries a few years later. I had a big smile on my face. Everyone was looking in the room. Why does the congressman have a smile on his face? Hasan got an 85. Just a public service announcement for all of you.
Look, I saw Mr. Wilner a couple years ago at a conference, social studies conference. He came up, and I knew that you had gotten a better grade than me in government. And I said, Mr. Wilner, you know, the only reason why I took that class is because Hakeem told me to. And I said, I feel like I got set up. Mr. Wilner's good people. There's a lot of educators, a lot of teachers who are with us in the room today. Please give it up. Okay. And one of the letters that you highlighted in the book is knowledge over kangaroo courts. But this idea of knowledge, Mr. Wilner imparting knowledge about government, but you know, so many of our in this moment, so much, particularly we'll get to the election soon enough, but there was so much misinformation and disinformation, some of it fueled by a lack of knowledge by people. Why did you choose to focus on knowledge in these ABCs of democracy as it's related to democracy?
Yeah, I think because we do live in an era of misinformation and disinformation, and it's become overwhelming. It's a great thing that the media ecosystem, you know, has grown in such a significant way, but it also creates challenges. And, you know, you have a lot of Americans who don't get their news now from traditional news sources. Don't get it from ABC, CBS, NBC. That, you know, was the case, of course, the days of Walter Cronkite. We're not going back there, but that was sort of a foundation of everyone having the same baseline of information, knowledge about what's happening, you know, in their community, what's happening in the country, what's happening in the world. That dynamic has changed now significantly. First with the rise of cable news, and then beyond cable news, now, of course, social media, podcasts, and other forms of disseminating information. And so having that baseline of knowledge that is objective, that we can all agree to, you might come to different conclusions, but that baseline of knowledge is incredibly important in any democracy. And now that we are living in this environment of such a diffuse media ecosystem, I think we all are going to have to work through, you know, how we can reestablish some semblance of that. Teaching civics, of course, in elementary school and middle school and high school, I think will be perhaps an important part of that. The foundation of what government of the people, by the people, and for the people are all about. These are things we should be able to agree upon, and hopefully we can get back to that place. Kangaroo court situation, of course, was a little bit of a reference to some of the unnecessary theater that we see on Capitol Hill with the show hearings that exist from time to time, and you know, certainly some concerns that have emerged out of the justice system.
Wonderful. You know, we have not only the photograph of your high school graduation, but this is an image of the four of us at my college graduation. So this is 1994 at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Our parents met down the road from here at Central State University here in Ohio. Both were from the Northeast and met here in Ohio. So if it wasn't for Ohio, we wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for Central State, we wouldn't be here. But, you know, if you recall, you know, mom and dad, especially our mom, you know, always told us when we were youngsters within the family, like, y'all are going to college, right? It's not even a question of what are you going to college. It's like, what are you going to be doing after? Like, what, you know, talk to us about professional school and graduate school after. We were like 6 years old, like, okay. But it was one requirement, right? The only thing is our mom. The only thing our mom said, it's like, you can go anywhere you want. You can't stay here, right? Like, you got to get out of the house. And I always thought, you know, she wanted us to see the world. But now with kids of my own, I realize that she just wanted the house. But so I went on to graduate school after Morehouse College, and you went to a master's degree in public policy, Georgetown, and then NYU Law School. And this is a photograph of you giving the speech, student address at NYU Law School. For the record, by the way, I missed my master's graduation to attend his, I'm just saying, sacrifices of the younger son for the older one. Let's just note.
But he's paying me back right now on Twitter.
One of the illustrations in the book is the Constitution over the Colt. The Constitution over the Colt. And I'm not sure everyone realizes, right? I mean, that you are a trained lawyer. I mean, and one of the things I truly admire and appreciate about you professionally is your grasp of the Constitution. So not just as a litigator, but your understanding of the Constitution. Why was that so important? And also that framing the Constitution over the Colt.
Well, I think that it was George Washington, of course, our first president, heroic leader in the country's journey, who, after completing his second term, and this was a period of time where there were no term limits on the presidency. It exists now.
We hope.
Thank goodness. But there were no term limits on the presidency, and that was put in the 1940s. Prior to that, it was imparted tradition. Most presidents only served 2 terms. FDR actually was in his 4th term, and there were clearly extraordinary events that were taking place, the Great Depression and then World War II. But at the beginning of the journey, president could have been president for life. But George Washington concludes that America is going to be, a nation of rules, not men. And in order to try to bring that about, one of the foundational principles, the constitutional principles, I'm not going to seek a 3rd term. And so he delivers his farewell address, and in his farewell address says something that I always thought was so incredibly profound. He says, "The Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all." Presidents, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, business folk, all. Sacredly obligatory upon all. And so, working my way through the alphabet, it was clear there was no option other than C being the Constitution, and then comparing that to, cult-like allegiance to a single individual. And at different moments of time, that can be different individuals, but that is always a challenge. It's the corollary to a nation anchored fundamentally in the rule of law, and the Constitution being the preeminent doctrine. Now, I know there are a lot of folks, of course, disappointed with the outcome of the election, and we work through those challenges, and the pendulum swings back and forth. But what was interesting in terms of the events of the last week, and an incoming president is at the zenith of their power in the weeks following their election. That's when they're at the zenith of their power. And I think it's fair to say that some of the choices that were put forward by the incoming administration were quite unconventional.
They were ridiculous. But go ahead.
See, I was just setting up my baby brother for that. So they were ridiculous. And several fall into that category, and we're working our way through them. But clearly, the person who was put forth for the Department of Justice, uniquely unqualified for the job and potentially dangerous as it relates to that position. And there was an open question: would the constitutional principles of separate and co-equal branches of government, of advice and consent, hold at all? As out of control as that choice, would it hold? And it did. And it did. In that instance, Matt Gaetz will not be the next Attorney General of the United States of America. Now, there's a lot of work to do. But it was at least a glimmer of hope that these principles in this Constitution, ahead of a cult-like allegiance to a single individual at a given point in time, still have some power, still have some resonance.
Wonderful. January 6th. This is a photograph of you on January 6th. You were on the floor of the House, and you write in the introduction to the book about how January 6th and the events leading up to and certainly in that moment inform, sort of motivate the reason for the book. I mean, it's background that's also foreground. You know, one of the things that you point out, and this is another illustration, the idea of reason, right? Over racism, I believe it is. And we'll talk about the racism in a second, but the reason, you know, January 6th, as I understand it, one of the reasons that motivated, that animated, you know, all of those folk to storm the Capitol is that they believe the big lie. They believe that the 2020 election had been stolen. And the reason why they believed it in the absence of evidence was that then President Donald Trump said it had been stolen. But specifically, he had said that it had been stolen in very specific places. And he was beginning to say the same things leading up to this election. The election was stolen in Detroit. It was stolen in Atlanta. It was stolen in Milwaukee. And no surprise, all these were majority black cities. So the reason, not reason as we think, but the reason in part for January 6th was racism. I mean, it animated folk. And we saw leading into this election that Donald Trump was leaning hard into racism. Right here in Ohio, we had all this nonsense about Springfield and our beloved Haitian immigrants who have come. We grew up in New York City, the center of the Haitian diaspora, eating dogs and cats. But it was an appeal to racism. And in many ways, and I would argue that racism in this election won out over reason. How would you respond to that?
I think that there are a complex series of inputs that go into any election generally, but particularly a national election, and particularly one like this where you had a former president seeking to be the president once again, and you had the vice president, historic figure in terms of both gender and the combination of gender and a woman of color running for the first time. And there were certainly forces animated by that extraordinary, groundbreaking effort. Vice President did not lean in to her gender, did not lean into her race. She was focused on running, I think, what was a hopeful, optimistic campaign designed to bring people together, solve problems on behalf of hardworking American taxpayers. She only had 107 days to do it, and I think she did an extraordinary job under difficult circumstances. Now, my takeaway, it's interesting, when you hear some of the Trump folks talk about how they moved significant pockets of communities of color, particularly in high-cost jurisdictions, which is where the movement was the greatest amongst communities of color, certainly the high cost of living became an overriding dynamic of this election. We're still waiting on the data. We're still waiting on the after-action full scope of what happened. But I think there's reason to conclude that the cost of living for far too many everyday Americans is way too high. And there was a belief that notwithstanding all of the positive indicators of a recovering economy that related to incredible job growth, a low unemployment rate, of course the stock market which doesn't hit most everyday Americans, but economic growth, all pointing in the right direction. Best economy of any developed economy of any country in the world post-pandemic. But post-pandemic inflation hit everyday Americans hard. And they view the economy, understandably, through the lens of, what am I paying for eggs or for milk or for bread when I go to the supermarket? What am I paying for gas, which has come down but was significantly higher in the first few years in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic slowing down? And housing costs way too high in city after city across the country and beyond, increasingly in exurban America and small town America and the heartland of America. And that became a dominant issue. And as a result of that, there was a belief that the administration that was in office, the president and the vice president, had just not done enough, even though there had been an extraordinary amount that had been done. And I think it's going to be incredibly important for us as Democrats. It's one of the things that we've talked about, is to make it clear that we actually are the party that wants to make a difference in the lives of all Americans, working class Americans all across the country of every race. And because it was interesting that you saw significant movement amongst African American men, particularly in inner city communities, those that you talked about, and certainly amongst Latino men, and within the Asian American community as well.
I teach history. I don't know if you remember that. All right. You were just in Montgomery, Alabama, a few days ago, and I don't know if you got to see, because we didn't get to talk about it. There's an Equal Justice Initiative has just unveiled a new sculpture garden.
Yes.
Did you get to go?
No.
Okay.
But I'm scheduled to go next year.
All right. See, that's what he just gets to go to places. I got to ask permission from my chair. You can't see over your shoulder, but
Brian Stevenson, by the way, of course, who leads that effort extraordinary.
who we've had here at Ohio State.
Yeah.
Variously over times. NYU professor.
He was my law professor.
There you go.
That's right.
I know him too. See, I want to make that clear. He was a visionary behind the museum there, but then also this sculpture garden. And there is this, one of the sculptures is this mammoth tablet. It's almost like a book. And as you walk through the garden, this is the final sculpture. And it's a list of names. And on those, as I was making my way through the garden, I thought I would spend 20 minutes. I wound up spending 2 hours. And I'm coming up to this book, and I'm like, this sculpture, I'm like, oh, it must be a list of names of all the sort of sheroes and heroes who have fought for freedom among African Americans. I was like, but that's saying Frederick Douglass a lot of times. I mean, this thing is, 7 or 8 stories high. But when you get there, you realize it's not just the names of the heroes and sheroes. It's actually the names of every African American that appeared in the 1870 census. So it's the names, it's the surnames of those enslaved people who survived slavery and made it into freedom. And they have a QR code, and if you scan the QR code, you can find your surname. And so up here in the middle, you see Jeffries. You also see on my mother's side, Cephas. So, we are in this moment where, to go back to the question of knowledge and education, being at the Ohio State University, where there is a concerted effort not to deal with this history, not to deal with the past as it happened, to bury it, specifically African American history, and then chipping away at other forms of history. How can we, and now, the appointment with the election of Donald Trump, a desire just to do away with the Department of Education. In Texas and in Oklahoma, efforts to alter curriculums and infuse and center it around Christianity when clearly going against the Constitution and its notion of freedom of religion. But the question of education and teaching history as it happens and social studies and civics Like, what do you say to us, this campus community, university community, to all the teachers who are here, as we're feeling, especially teachers on the front lines who are, who are under attack for teaching history as it happened?
I had the opportunity a few months ago to go to the Munich Security Conference. It was an honor to be there, my first time in Germany. It's where all the leaders of the free world, heads of state are there, and then people from different parliaments and members of the United States Congress. And we were there on a bipartisan basis, Republicans and Democrats, all of us. Big topic was, how do we support the Ukrainian war effort, of course, and pushing back against Vladimir Putin and, that brutal invasion of the country. And we're going to have to navigate through some challenging times there. But at the Munich Security Conference, which, by the way, was also, it was my first time in Germany, but I mentioned when I was sitting talking to some diplomats from across the world that it was not my family's first time in Germany, because our father, of course, after he graduated from high school in Newark, joined the Air Force, went down the Mississippi to do basic training, and then was eventually deployed overseas in Germany during the Cold War. And that, was quite a moment, for me, just to be back over in the country where my father had been as a young American in uniform, standing up, for the free world in a different capacity. That's part of the American journey that all of us are on. But in the context of that trip, I had an opportunity to talk to the U.S. ambassador to Germany, Ambassador Gutman, very prominent philanthropist, educational leader. I think she once led the University of Pennsylvania, but she was the U.S. ambassador. And I was talking to her about some of the challenges, related to Germany and the rise of the far right, as we are in part experiencing to some degree here. I know Columbus just experienced a horrific march of some neo-Nazis, and I was asking her about, because we're seeing this in other parts of the world, including in Germany. And she said, in Germany, they take it very seriously because, of course, of the horrific history that had taken place in Germany around the Holocaust. And she said, subsequent to that, here in Germany, they practice something called the culture of remembrance. And I found that to be fascinating. She said, the culture of remembrance. I said, what's the culture of remembrance? She said, well, the view is that the shame is not in remembering the horrific things that may have occurred in this country. The shame is in intentionally trying to erase it. And I thought it was such a powerful assessment. And clearly there are some folks in this country who need to be taught to practice the culture of remembrance, because they want to erase the journey. Some of them in the United States Congress. And one of whom, colleague of Joyce and mine, who made the observation, African-American member of Congress on the other side of the aisle, made the observation that African-Americans were better off during Jim Crow. So I can't respond to every outrage, but I said I'm going to the House floor on this one because it was just too much to take. And I articulated on the House floor why I thought that was problematic, and then at the end, an Ice Cube lyric came to me, and I said, you better check yourself before you wreck yourself. That's part of the American journey that I've been on.
One of you have two sons, Jeremiah and Joshua. I have three girls. I'm a girl dad, Asha, Alkiana, and Alayla. And Alayla from the speech keyed in on this one turn of phrase, people over politics. That was her. That's what she keyed in on. We're from Brooklyn. This is the portrait that is now in Congress, in Capitol Hill, of Shirley Chisholm. Could you talk a little bit about what people over politics means? And let me actually say this. I have a sense of what it. I teach civil rights history, and I study grassroots organizing. One of the things that I've always respected about your approach to politics is captured in this thing that you do. It doesn't make sense here in Ohio, but in Brooklyn, you do this thing called Congress on the Corner, right? Where you literally set up shop at subway stations. That's called public transportation. We need to work on that, but. But it's this idea of creating access, right, to those who we send to office, making yourself accountable and visible and present. But could you say a little bit about what you mean by and what does it look like, certainly in the tradition of a Shirley Chisholm, of people over politics?
Yeah, it's an honor to stand on the shoulders.
Go ahead.
Honor to stand on the shoulders of Shirley Chisholm, extraordinary public servant, of course, first black woman ever elected to the United States Congress from Brooklyn, and actually was our first member of Congress. And it's an honor to now represent large parts of the district that Shirley Chisholm once represented. I think that's you, brother.
Security nervous, but go ahead.
But and so that's quite the journey for us in the House. Our view is that the House was designed to be the institution by the framers that would be closest to the American people, right? To reflect the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, the fears, the concerns, the anxieties, the passions of the people, the life experiences of the American people. I think it was John Adams who said when they were talking about the proposed House of Representatives that it should be like an exact portrait of the American people, look and feel and think like the American people writ large. And so we take that seriously, in the House. It's the reason why, by the way, the House has the 2-year term as compared to the presidency, 4 years, the Senate, 6 years. I mean, imagine that, 6-year term, Joyce, must be nice. And of course, the Supreme Court, life tenure, which as soon as we get an opportunity, we are going to do something about that. We're going to do something about that. But when you think about that constellation, 2, 4, 6, life, the House is on one side of that spectrum to stay the closest to the people. So, our view, it was just really an illustration of that the House at all times, yes, we're a rough and tumble institution, and you've got Democrats and Republicans with different views, progressives and conservatives with different views, the left and the right, center. But we should always focus on putting the American people first. There's a time to campaign, and then there's a time to govern. And when it's a time to govern, you got to put people over politics.
So how do you do that moving forward in this? I swear I'm not moving. How do you do that in moving forward in this coming Congress, in which half of the Congress folk, or a significant percentage of them, are more interested in politics than the people? Yeah.
I think our view has been, and someone sent me some polling around public sentiment earlier today, coming out of this election, 86% of the American people want to see Democrats and Republicans work together in the new Congress. That makes sense because they're big problems. Now, the approach that we've taken is that we will find bipartisan common ground with our Republican colleagues in the incoming administration on any issue whenever and wherever possible in order to solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers, to deliver real results, to get things done, particularly as it relates to lowering the dramatically high cost of living for everyday Americans, that we will seek to find bipartisan common ground. But at the same period of time, push back against extremism whenever necessary, and be very clear about what that means for us, that we will protect Social Security, protect Medicare, protect the Affordable Care Act, protect the efforts that we've made to combat the climate crisis, protect the right to vote, and we will always and continue to aggressively protect a woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decision. And if the far right crosses into those spaces, they will have a fight on their hands. And that's the approach that we are going to take. And I've made the observation that, you had a close election that broke in one direction across the battleground states, but was basically a 51-49 election, and it was 50-50 heading in to the election, and it broke 51-49, and it all went in one direction. But notwithstanding that fact, at the top, you still had, a Senate with a substantial number of Democratic senators who will be returning. We're all certainly saddened by Senator Brown's pending departure, although he could have a shot in 2 years. Because there'll be a vacancy created by that other senator who I won't mention. And in the House, it's basically an evenly divided House, where the House Republican majority will be up by a handful of seats. We're certainly disappointed that we weren't able to net enough seats in a tough environment to get to the 218 that we need, but it looks like it could be a 220 to 215 House of Representatives. That will actually be the smallest majority that any incoming party, Democrats or Republicans, will have had since prior to the Great Depression. And, we'll be a lean, mean fighting machine to defend American values, and that's how we're going to approach this thing. I mentioned to some of our colleagues in a meeting that Joyce and I were at that we've got, writ large, one mission in two parts, over the next 2 years as House Democrats. Work with the incoming administration whenever possible, of course, put that to the side. But one mission in two parts beyond that, which is to stop Project 2025, and implement Project 2026 and take back control of the House of Representatives. One mission in two parts.
We have a wonderful tech team, and they're all students. We got great students at The Ohio State University. Let's give it up to our students at The Ohio State University.
I think the problem may be the suspenders. You showed up looking fancy and you're jamming up the tech.
Leave me alone. Hopefulness over hatred. This was earlier this spring, in June, this summer. We went to the White House, and myself and my daughters, we went and we got to take this snapshot with sitting President Joe Biden. I know George Washington is like, man, I ain't had this in mind, looking over. It is what it is, George. But I felt hopefulness. I look at that picture and see my girls and their friends and so many others here. I mean, I think so many of us going into this election were hopeful. When Kamala Harris was elevated to the top of the ticket, there was a lot of hope, right? I mean, obviously Barack Obama running on hope and change, but there was a different kind of hope that we could put some of that hatred, some of that hate behind us, right? Not pretending it doesn't exist, but behind us. And then the election didn't turn out the way that many of us would have liked. And I, for one, was among those who were like, oh my God, right? Like I felt it. I felt the weight of that. And I'm just, to be honest, just kind of coming out of it now, realizing, we got to fight. We're not going to give up. We're in this thing, as you were saying, right? No pressure on you, but make it happen. And but how do we hold on to hopefulness in this moment on the heels of the outcome of this election?
Yeah, I think it's such an incredibly important value and idea for us to carry with us moving forward. And talking to some young people back at home and others who, as you've indicated, disappointed by the election, and that's understandable, and that's the reality of the moment in terms of the outcome of the election. But in a democracy, certainly as part of the American journey, 248 years that we've been on, the pendulum does tend to swing back and forth. And this, of course, is an extraordinary swing, what we've seen over the last 8 to 12 to 16 years. It's an extraordinary swing, but the pendulum does tend to swing back and forth. In just the last 40 or so years, we've gone from, George H.W. Bush to 8 years of Bill Clinton, 8 years of Bill Clinton, back to 8 years of George W. Bush, 8 years of George W. Bush to 8 years of Barack Obama, shattering the ultimate barrier and conducting himself in such an extraordinary way. 8 years of, yes, that's an applause line for Barack Obama. And 8 years of President Obama to 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Trump to 4 years of President Biden, who, did an extraordinary job under difficult circumstances. He inherited multiple crisis moments. He inherited a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a democracy crisis because of January 6th at the same time when he was sworn in on January 20th and, did an extraordinary job in trying to move the country forward in ways that I think will become clearer for the country writ large over the next few years and beyond. But pendulum swings from Barack Obama to Trump, Trump to Biden, Biden now back to Trump for 4 years. And that's part of the reality of the journey. I think what has caused such disappointment is because there was another opportunity for America to do an extraordinary thing, which is what America does as it relates to the election of Vice President Harris and what that would have represented. But I think, you had Shirley Chisholm, to go back to Shirley Chisholm, who ran in 1972, and she passed the baton to Geraldine Ferraro, who was the first woman as a major nominee to be vice president in 1984. And Congresswoman Ferraro passed that baton, of course, to Hillary Clinton, who was an extraordinary public servant and ran, a campaign and came close and won the popular vote, but fell a little short in terms of the Electoral College. Now, Hillary Clinton, of course, has passed that baton to Kamala Harris, who advanced the ball even further. And someday soon, Kamala Harris, we don't know who it is right now, passes that baton to a woman who will go on to be the President of the United States of America. That's the hope of the American journey.
We are a family of sports fans, and this was a photograph. Our father's 80th birthday, we came out, brought him and my mom out here And myself, you, your boys, we went to the shoe and caught an OSU football game. Our father just passed away at the end of last year, and this was one of the last outings I think that we had together as a family on his 80th birthday. So shout out to our dad, who is still very much with us in all of our hearts. But there's a big game coming up next week. And as we move to the part of the program where I take your questions, I just wanted to ask you, do you have a prediction for what the outcome of that game with that team up north will be?
Yeah.
Mind you where you are.
We got to beat that team up north, and we will beat that team up north. And then it's on to the college football playoffs. Yeah.
That's a good politician there, right? I mean, so we have a few minutes to take and share a few questions that were submitted by the audience. One question. The audience today includes several hundred Ohio State University students, many of whom are preparing for careers in politics and public service. What advice would you give them as they try to make their way into a professional environment that is increasingly polarized and fraught?
It's a great question, and so encouraged by all of the students who are here today, and all of the students and the young people who I have encountered across the country as I've traveled into different congressional districts, the Midwest, the South, the Southwest, the East Coast, the West Coast, in the context of this most recent campaign, and young people all across the country working hard on these campaigns, committed to American democracy and to the journey in public service. It's one of the things that does keep me hopeful about where we are as a country and where we will continue to go moving forward, notwithstanding the clear challenges and turbulence of the moment that I will never understate, but keeping that hopefulness. When it comes to young people who are interested in careers of public service, a very noble calling, one of the points that I try to make is that resilience and perseverance will be incredibly important, particularly if you decide that you want to run for office yourself as a candidate, because it doesn't always work out the first time. I was having this conversation with one of our candidates, we call them red to blue candidates, a few days ago, who were challenging an incumbent Republican in one of the important races across the country, and she fell about 1.5 points short. And of course was disappointed, but I reminded her of a few different things. I said, you often see the journey and the end of the journey, but you don't see the beginning of it. And at the beginning of the journey, there was often challenges, adversity, disappointment before the ultimate success comes. And I pointed out that, I ran for a seat in the New York State Assembly, state legislature twice, and lost twice before I won my first race. And what eventually helped me get back on the horse, win that third time I challenged an incumbent, the first two times came reasonably close, not as close as this particular candidate, 1.5% loss, but was disappointed both times, is that when I looked at others who eventually, rise to some of the highest heights of their political journey, but you look at the beginning, there was adversity, there was loss often. I pointed out that at least 3 presidents, recent presidents, lost their first congressional race. George W. Bush lost his first congressional race. I think it was in 1978. Bill Clinton lost his first congressional race in 1974. And this was in the Watergate year when Democrats were winning. That was, y'all know what a wave election is, right? Of course, there's wave elections. 2018 was a wave election for us, and 2010 was a wave election for them. Then 2006 was a wave election for Democrats. And before that, 1994 was a wave election for Republicans. 1974 was a wave election for Democrats. We're working on making sure 2026 is a wave election. But 1974 was a wave election for Democrats. And Bill Clinton was one of the few Democrats defeated by a Republican in a competitive election across the country that year. Bill Clinton, one of the great political talents. And Barack Obama, of course, famously lost his first congressional race when he challenged a congressman named Bobby Rush, who Joyce and I served with for a long period of time. In fact, he lost that congressional race by about 24 points. Bobby Rush never lets us forget that. And so, can you imagine Barack Obama runs for Congress, loses by 24 points, laid out on the ground, and then 4 years later gets back up off the canvas, doesn't run for Congress again, runs for the United States Senate, wins, and is off to the races. Churchill once said, I say this to all the young college students who are here, Churchill once said that success is not final, failure is not fatal, all that matters is the courage to continue. And, you know, I put it a different way. A knockdown is different from a knockout. That's the Hakeem Jeffries remix, y'all. But success is not final, failure is not fatal, all that matters is the courage to continue. You know, and I say to young people, you have all the talent, all the capacity, the heart, the soul, the intellect, the spirit in the world. Doesn't mean that you'll always get there the first time. You may get knocked down, but you do have the capacity to pick yourself up off the ground, like George W. Bush did, like Bill Clinton did, like Barack Obama did. Keep marching towards your dream, because, you know, people often focus on the glory, but they miss the story. And when they see the story, they'll understand how you ultimately get to the glory, and often it's through adversity.
Thank you for those lyrics. Another question. You have worked closely with former Speaker Emerita of the House, Nancy Pelosi. I like this. Can you share what you learned from her leadership? So a leadership question.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that she would often say to us is, at a certain point, you just have to make a decision. Like, what are the questions that you're confronting on behalf of the American people? Grapple with those questions as thoughtfully as you can, but there comes a point in time where you have to make a decision. And make that decision and stick with it, defend it with your colleagues, defend it in the Congress, defend it before the country. That, you know, a level of decisiveness, of course, that, you know, Speaker Pelosi is legendary for having, and that was, you know, an incredibly important part of, you know, one of the things that myself and Catherine Clark and Pete Aguilar and Joyce and all of us who've had the opportunity to serve with extraordinary leaders like a Nancy Pelosi and a Jim Clyburn and John Lewis and, you know, so many others, and Maxine Waters. I remember my first CBC meeting. Joyce and I go into the CBC meeting. It's our first meeting together, Congressional Black Caucus. And the CBC meets every Wednesday over lunch at 12 noon. And, you know, I walk into the room and Charlie Rangel is there, Maxine Waters, Eddie Bernice Johnson, Barbara Lee, John Conyers, John Lewis, great Jim Clyburn. And I'm thinking to myself, how did they let Hakeem Jeffries sneak into this room? Part of the beauty of the congressional journey has been the legends that we, you know, have served with, and working alongside Speaker Pelosi, and then having the ability, you know, to, as she passed the torch to the next generation of Democrats and move forward. We're a very diverse caucus. I'll just say this, very diverse caucus. And, you know, I've concluded that the most important 4 words that I can say to anyone on any issue. Democrats, progressives, New Dems, Blue Dog conservatives, the Women's Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, Hispanic Caucus, LGBTQ Equality Caucus, we do reflect the American people, is what do you think, right? To make sure that I have a full understanding of what everyone thinks on a given issue. But once you have that, information, once you've had the exuberant discussions that we should have on behalf of the American people, eventually you got to find the highest common denominator to get something done for the American people and then move forward. And that's how we've tried to proceed over the last few years.
Thank you. You mentioned in your response the diversity of the House caucus, of the Democrats in the House, and that diversity is one of its strengths. Currently, we are in this country, particularly in higher education, the question of diversity is coming under attack. Diversity, equity, inclusion somehow has become a bad turn of phrase, and diversity is being dropped from the list of top priorities for universities around the country. Here's a question. In recent years, we've heard a lot about the erosion of trust in higher education. What do you think is driving that erosion? And how are partisan politics shaping the people's perceptions of the role that higher education plays in the success of our democracy?
So higher education is and will continue to be an incredibly important part of, our journey. I think what is interesting is when we were working in 2017 into 2018, after that 2016 election and the disappointment and the shock of it all, and House Democrats were regrouping to try to figure out how we sharpen our arguments to the American people in advance of that midterm election in 2018, and we successfully did, and we flipped the House and we won 40 seats, and it was a wave. And we're now, involved in that same type of after-action analysis and introspection and preparation for sharpening the arguments that we'll have to make to the American people about our commitment to improving their quality of life. One of the things I learned in that context was that 67.5% of adults aged 24 or older in the United States of America did not have a 4-year college degree. 67.5%. Now that was, an extraordinary fact for me because of what you referenced earlier, that, growing up, Mom and certainly our grandma, Nano, made clear that, you're going to, the two of us, you're going to graduate from elementary school, and then you're going to graduate from, middle school, and then you're going to graduate from high school, and then you're going to go to college, and once you graduate from college, you're going to go to graduate school and either get a law degree or go become a professor or a doctor or an MBA. We were like, Grandma, we're going to be in school our whole lives. Our whole lives. But that was the path that appropriately in the neighborhood and the communities that we had come up from, that was seen as the path toward a better way of life. And it's proven to be, successful. In fact, the interesting thing is that, as you may recall, our grandma Nano was so committed to this principle of higher education that every time we graduated, starting with elementary school, she would give us $500 cash. This was in the 80s, into the 90s. Now, I made the mistake of telling that story in front of my 2 sons one day.
I'm not happy that you just shared it right now, actually.
And they were like, Dad, you've been shortchanging us our entire lives. But she was so committed to that principle. And that will continue to be so incredibly important and transformational, college education at a great school like the Ohio State University, for so many Americans that we have to lean into. But at the same period of time, recognize that also for a significant number of everyday Americans for decades, the path into the middle-class dream has not involved a college education. And we have to make sure, and a lot of those jobs have gone overseas, and a lot of those towns and factories and plants have been shuttered. And President Biden has done a really good job of working hard to bring those jobs back, and we have to continue to lean into that dynamic. Last observation I'd make on this point about diversity, equity, and inclusion being under assault. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values. They are American values. And, you know, the motto of the United States of America, right? E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That's diversity. One of the most important constitutional principles in this country is equal protection under the law. That's equity. And we, of course, pledge allegiance to the flag. And as we pledge allegiance to the flag, we talk about liberty and justice for all. ALL. That's inclusion. Let's be clear. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values that we must defend.
Thank you. So we'll do two more questions and we'll wrap up. I like this question. It ties into the book. If you could have Donald Trump read it says more, but I think we would all be happy if he just read. If you could have Donald Trump read and internalize one letter of the alphabet, what would it be and why?
Yeah.
I like Constitution, but go ahead.
Yeah.
There's a lot of them. Hatred. I mean, you know.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say M, maturity over Mar-a-Lago, which is the only reference, right? And by that I really meant, and again, we're willing to work with the incoming administration on the issue, but you know, in that illustration, we have a great American president from every century. And of course, it's George Washington, first American century, second American century, Abraham Lincoln, third American century, FDR, final American century, you know, President Barack Obama. And it's designed just to say, you know, there were different life experiences amongst these four presidents, different worldviews, some of it connected, some of it not connected. But, you know, in their own way, they all put the country first. And there was a political maturity about their work, about their governance, about how they thought about the American journey. And I hope that in this second term, we can see that type of maturity. It doesn't mean that we are going to agree on a lot of issues, and we'll probably disagree on a whole host of issues. But even in the first term, with the Trump administration, you know, we worked together on criminal justice reform. The First Step Back, I was the lead Democratic sponsor of that bill. Someone who's become a friend, Doug Collins, a conservative Republican from rural Georgia. He was the lead sponsor on the other side of the aisle, and we worked together, we got it done, and eventually the left, the right, conservatives, progressives, the NAACP and the Koch brothers, the ACLU and the Heritage Foundation, all points in between, came together to support this criminal justice reform bill that was supported by large margins in the House and the Senate and signed into law by then President Trump. And hopefully we can find the common ground necessary in that regard. But I think what will present us the best opportunity, I'd go to W, which is working families over the well-connected. Because I think emerging from this election, half the country disappointed, but I think what clearly unites a lot of folks is this issue that there are challenges with the fundamental basic American dream being obtained by this generation of Americans And people, particularly in the heartland and in other parts of the country where things just haven't gone as well as they should have gone over the last few decades. The basic contract in America that when you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself, for your family, purchase a home, educate your children, have access to high-quality health care, go on vacation every now and then, and of course, one day retire with grace and dignity. And for far too many people, that American dream is out of reach. People struggling to live paycheck to paycheck just to get by and can't get ahead. And it's my hope that the new administration, that we don't see this effort just to reward millionaire and billionaire donors, the friends and family plan that sometimes impacts administrations, not with the right intentions when they come to Washington, but that we put working class Americans first. We put the middle class first. We put young people first. We put all those folks who aspire to be part of the middle class, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as Americans. As Americans.
Amen. Amen. That would be a great place to end, but I want to give the last word, the last question to a student. And I have a couple former students in here, and one in particular. Where's Madison? Where's Madison Tracy? Madison Tracy with her grandma. Go ahead, stand up. Yeah. So Madison, I had Madison in a course, civil rights history, but we took it during the pandemic. So we actually never met. 2 classes, African American History through Film, I think it was as well, right? So, but we never met face to face until this election season. So that was 4 years ago. We had this wonderful class, wonderful student. Grandma was peeking around the corner and checking out the class too, so it was great to have her. But we met face to face this season as she was working with one of the county Democrats, county Democratic parties, and working hard for one of the county Democratic parties. And so this is what she asked, and I'd like to end here. So this past election, we lost a great senator in the state of Ohio, Senator Brown. His opponent's campaign attacked him with lie after lie, and Ohioans were fed this mostly via mail and television ads. Democrats, including the Brown camp, responded with ads rebuking the lies and telling the truth, often sounding very centrist. What is your take on how Democrats can combat the disinformation war in future elections? And she ends by saying, "We tried educating and telling the truth." This is really a commentary on us. We tried educating and telling the truth, and it did not work. Yeah. So what do you say, not just to Madison, but really to all of us who are committed to teaching truth, to telling truth, but it seems to fall on deaf ears?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a wonderful place to end, because it really is the action item that is in front of us in terms of keeping this great democracy thing going that we have, which relates to what many of us perceive as a far-right subterranean disinformation machine that exists on the other side of the aisle that in many ways was not visible to our campaigns and our candidates in ways that would have allowed us to more forcefully respond. You can see the TV ads and you can see the radio ads, but in this era of social media, in this era of podcasts to some degree, but even beneath the podcasts, the messaging chat groups, the gaming, that is occurring, and the messaging that occurs directed at gamers and others that are now beginning to emerge. Right? There's a significant network of disinformation that became difficult for some of our candidates to overcome, and that I think hit the vice president hard and hit others hard. And campaigns can be rough and tumble, and that's fine. But this gets back to our original point of having, a core foundation with which to debate about. Right? Folks are entitled to their opinions, not their own set of facts, as I think John Adams also once said. And so I think as Democrats, what we have to do is really develop our own message delivery system that can reach every single American, to offer them our ideas, our values, what we're about, and combat the disinformation. And that will be an important project that we'll undertake over the next few years in preparation for 2028, but also in connection with 2026. Technology can always be used for good, or it can be exploited by bad actors. And some of those bad actors are in other parts of the world who use this disinformation to divide us. Some of them are part of the political system here in America. And so that's something that we're going to work on. And I think I'll just end by making the observation about, how we think about moving forward, this journey that we're on. Not a perfect country, as you teach so eloquently and powerfully, but always a march toward a more perfect union, which is what has been promised us. And how do we keep that going? And I think for me, there is the recognition that, presidents come, presidents go. And elections come, elections go. But American values have to endure. And I remember when I was a young lawyer in 2004, being bitterly disappointed at what happened. How could George W. Bush be reelected? I thought to myself, failed war in Iraq, failed war in Afghanistan, financial mismanagement that eventually resulted in the collapse of the economy and the Great Recession. Who knew, by the way, some of us would miss George W. Bush so much. But at the time, bitterly disappointed. What does this say about America, is what I was asking then in 2004. But then, over the next few years, you see, wait, on this same day that the president was reelected, Barack Obama was elected for the first time to the United States Senate in 2004. And then just 2 short years later, Democrats resoundingly took back control of the House and, unexpectedly, the Senate. And then just 4 years from that 2004 disappointment, Barack Obama was, of course, elected as the 44th President of the United States of America. And I'll never forget, of course, there were headlines from all across the country and the world. The one that got my attention was a headline from a major newspaper in Western Europe that said, "America does it again." America does it again. That's the journey that we've been on. We've always fought through the resilience, fought through the turbulence to get to a better place on the other side. That kind of resilience is going to be required of all of us over these next few years. But if we continue to do what the John Lewises and the Rosa Parks and so many others would have encouraged us to do, which is to show up and stand up, speak up for what we know is right, then in the next 2 years and certainly in the next 4 years, I think we can look forward to another triumphant moment and another headline from somewhere across the world that says, "America does it again."
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, my big brother, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries.
Thank you. All right, appreciate it. All right. Huh? What's that?
I think it's only fair in concluding that we thank Mrs. Jeffries for raising 2 such extraordinary people. If you want additional copies of the book, you know where to find them at Gramercy Books. Thank you all for being with us today, and have a wonderful, happy Thanksgiving.